So welcome back for some more conspiracy theories, unexplained mysteries, and just overall craziness of the world, right? But before we get to the madness, I need y'all help. I need you to help me unplug some more people out of the matrix. And you do that by hitting the like button, then putting hashtag unplugged in the comment section. All right? And if you're new, subscribe. Let's get to it today.
Hello, I'm Lucy Gray. Welcome to the programme. We start with a historic mission to the moon and the launch of India's Chandrayaan-3 spacecraft. This is the moment that it took off just under an hour ago. It entered Earth's orbit shortly after. It's India's second attempt at a lunar landing, and if it's successful, the craft will deploy a rover near the moon's south pole next month. And India will...
How did I miss this live? Did y'all watch this live the other day? I don't even know how I missed it.
Become only the fourth country behind the US, the former Soviet Union and China to manage a controlled lunar landing. A little earlier, I spoke to astronomer and podcast host Jennifer Millard, who talked us through the launch of the rocket and explained how long it would take before it reaches the moon.
Once it's there, it'll orbit the moon a few times before attempting to deploy the lander and then the rover, which is contained within the lander. So yeah, we've got a little bit to wait. We're expecting it to get to the moon 23rd, 24th of August. That's the rough timeline. And then, yeah, hopefully India will become only the fourth.
Does that time frame not still blow y'all's mind? She just talked about the 23rd, 24th of August, right? For me, I used to just think instantly takes off. It gets wherever it's going fast. You know what I mean? I guess I was just so focused on the sheer power coming from the takeoff and the thrusters and everything that it was getting to where it's going. But then once I really put both feet in and dug into the information of space and how far and the distance of everything, now I'm like, wow, like, no, it's not like that. It takes time to get to these places.
Fourth nation to have a successful soft landing on the surface of the moon, which is absolutely incredible if you think about it. It's only the US, Russia and China that have achieved this, and yeah, India are going for it. You know, they haven't done too much in terms of space exploration, so this is a really ambitious mission, but that's what they tend to do. You know, they were the first Asian nation to reach Mars as well. They've got an orbiter around the moon now that's been operating for over 3 years very successfully as part of Chandrayaan-2. So yeah, expect great things from India and space in the future. So it was actually the Chandrayaan program that discovered water at the south pole of the moon and concretely discovered water on the moon. That was the first time that had ever been done. That was back in 2008. And then, of course, they're really making amazing progress, spending very little money on these projects. You know, when we look at NASA's, the budgets run into hundreds of millions, billions of dollars, whereas the Chandrayaan ones are doing it for $75 million, something like that. We spend more on making movies, and yet India are going to explore.
How are they able to do that so much more cheaply?
So again, it's doing things like taking their time, so using the least amount of fuel possible. That cuts down on the budget. Using smaller craft, so this rover, you know, is not the sort of size of a car that you would expect with the Martian rovers. This one is on its biggest dimension. It's about 1 meter long. And so then that reduces the cost as well. You know, lower mass as well is always cheaper. And it's very, very specific targets. You know, we only expect this rover to be working for 1 lunar day. That's one of the things with the timing of this mission as well, is to get there for the start of a lunar day. So we've got that full 2 weeks to make the most of all of that solar power to charge the batteries. And so it means that India can do these extraordinary missions and extraordinary science on a very, very low budget, and does show that you don't need to spend all of this money necessarily to do amazing exploration in space.
But at the same time, that'll be what they use to kind of, you know what I mean? If something goes wrong, they'll start pointing at that. Oh, it's because they went the cheap route and they try to do everything budget friendly, and this is why they skimped on this, and this is why. So if anything goes wrong, you could bet people are sitting on the sidelines right now waiting on an opportunity for something to go wrong for them to shoot it down and say, okay, this is why. This is why you can't, you know what I mean, take the cheap route per se. But I hope it's a success.
Jennifer Millard there. Well, let's speak now to Prasad Subramanian, who is a professor of at Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm assuming that you watched the launch and are following its progress. What can you tell us? What's your assessment of how things are going?
Things are going very well. Fingers crossed. But I believe we've passed the most crucial stage of the launch. And so as of now, yeah, things couldn't be going better.
So just to explain what's happened, there was blast off, and then the boosters separated from the rocket, didn't they? Those boosters have now fallen into the ocean, and I understand it has now entered Earth's orbit. And then just if you could just explain what's happening, because it's going to orbit the Earth several times, isn't it, before it does this sort of slingshot movement and tries to get into the lunar orbit.
That's right, exactly. It's a matter of entering the moon's primarily the moon's gravitational pull, and it's a complex maneuver. And to be clear, the rover per se is going to land on the moon only in about 2 weeks or something like that from now.
23rd or 24th of August, they've said. Yeah,
that's right. Yes, something like that. So in between now and then, it's a lot of fairly complicated orbital dynamics that's going to happen.
Basically trying to build up speed, though, I understand.
Yes. The slingshot's a very good analogy. You need to get your stone right in the right trajectory. So that's pretty much what it is. But easily put. But
the easy part. Well, the really difficult part apparently is landing on the moon, and I know that India tried it once before and it didn't go so well. So
right.
Talk us through why this is so tricky, what it involves.
To the extent I understand, it's a matter of think of trying to land on your feet while jumping the top of a building. You need to make sure your feet are strong. I wouldn't recommend this to anybody, but if you were trying to do that, you need to.
I'm so glad he said that just in the preface that, people take things too literally these days.
Make sure your feet don't buckle, and there's a lot of rebound, and you're not very sure about the composition of the soil where you're landing. So all these things. So that's why it's a combination of mechanics. And mostly mechanics.
So Sorry, I was just going to ask if you could explain what the mission is. As I said, the aim is to land on the South Pole. And we don't know a huge amount, do we, about the actual South Pole?
That's right. That's precisely why we're trying to go there. And the mission, the scientific objectives are manifold. Broadly put, lunar geochemistry, and of course, presence of water ice, which is the Holy Grail, and understanding how the lunar surface came to be what it is now, understanding the impact of the solar wind, something that I'm personally interested in, how the solar wind particles impact the moon's atmosphere, or the lack of it, and how they influence the geochemistry of the lunar surface. This is about as much as I broadly understand.
Yeah. Well, so far so good. So we will see, I suppose, won't we, in the coming weeks. Thank you very much for talking to us, Prasad Subramanian, who is a professor at the Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research. Thank you.
Houston, we've had a problem. Fire in the cockpit.
These creepy audios were recorded by astronauts during the Apollo space missions. NASA informs us about the scientific discoveries that have been made thanks to this project, and of course, about the main achievement, landing a human on the moon. But what NASA doesn't like to talk about is at what cost they did it. Flying into space is a difficult task, but what is even more difficult is to return from there alive. So what were the most dangerous Apollo missions?
And that's interesting when we was just talking about India's launch and how they did it for cheap. Now we're hearing about the expense it takes to not only go there, but to come back.
The morning of July 16th, 1969. An American astronaut, Buzz Aldrin, puts a tiny bowl, breadcrumbs, and a handwritten Bible verse postcard into a small vacuum bag. Very soon, he will accomplish what no one has ever done before him in the history of humankind. he'll step onto the moon's surface as part of the Apollo 11 mission. But this isn't Buzz's first time in space. As a member of the Apollo 8 crew, he's already completed a human-crewed orbital flight to the moon. The first 10 Apollo projects focused on testing spacecraft, developing technology for spaceflight, and training the astronauts. However, this time, Buzz and his partner, Commander Neil Armstrong, were supposed to land on the moon for the first time, not just observe it from afar. A team of 4,000 people spent several decades developing this flight, and Buzz Aldrin himself spent 2 years training. Thus, the astronaut was utterly sure of the mission's success and didn't worry at all. He put the bag he'd just collected in his pocket and went to work, not even suspecting that he would have to go through all the circles of hell. The launch of the Saturn V launch vehicle was broadcast live on TV in 33 countries on 6 continents. In the United States alone, about 25 million viewers watched it. So at the time of launch, Buzz Aldrin felt the euphoria of all rock stars combined. After a successful takeoff, it took the astronauts 3 days to reach their destination. And now, this long-awaited moment came. The lunar module detached from the command module and was about to land on the moon. Suddenly, Aldrin saw that the navigator flashed the 1202 alarm. The command center reported that the computer was overloaded with tasks and the navigation system couldn't cope. The module...
I'd be like, oh God, oh God, what's going on? As soon as that alarm went off, like, that's the one place you don't want to have any hiccups or nothing go wrong. I understand that they're very well trained and, you know what I mean, for all different type of situations and scenarios, but it still is like the one place you just don't want, you want that to go off without a hiccup.
Where the astronauts were began to sharply change the trajectory towards a dangerous rocky area. Captain Neil Armstrong decided to act immediately and switch to manual control. The fuel gauge readings were alarmingly low, and the rocket engine kicked up space dust that obscured the view. Even though they were about to crash, Buzz didn't doubt his partner for a second, and he was right. Neil managed to successfully land the module. The right to be the first to set foot on the moon's surface was granted to the ship's captain. Aldrin had to go down after him. He didn't even suspect that this would become his stigma for life. At all important events, he'll be called
the second man on the moon, the legendary Colonel Buzz Aldrin.
Although Buzz was a supporter of the scientific approach to understanding the world, he still believed in God. That's why he brought the communion kit to the ship. As Armstrong prepared to leave, Aldrin drank a drop of wine from a tiny bowl, ate breadcrumbs, and read a passage from the Bible. And only after that did he put on a spacesuit and leave the module. At that moment, it even seemed to him that he smelled the moon, which reminded him of wet ashes. At that moment, the astronaut realized that he hadn't prepared any great speeches for such a historic moment. Unlike Neil and his legendary phrase,
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
so Aldrin just said, magnificent desolation. On the moon's surface, the team collected soil samples.
I mean, I get it. I get it. It's not like one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. That was like pretty epic, you know. He should have practiced a little bit. I'm just saying. But it's still pretty dope and epic for him to say that.
Many photos and placed the equipment necessary for further research. In the middle of the mission, Buzz heard a radio signal through his earpiece informing him about some sudden important call. The astronauts sensed something was wrong. It turns out that the center discovered some kind of breakdown in the system, and they'll now be notified that they'll have to stay on the moon forever. But as it turned out, US President Richard Nixon himself got through to them on the moon. He asked about the astronauts' success and well-being and said they became the most famous people on Earth. After these words, Buzz planted a U.S. flag on the moon and left small presents with Neil. These were postage stamps, coins, an aluminum plate with a symbolic message for other civilizations, and most importantly, the Apollo 1 team commemorative medal. After 21 hours and 36 minutes on the moon, it was time to head back. The astronauts successfully took off and docked with the command module. But during their return to Earth, real danger awaited them. After the astronauts' capsule passed through the atmosphere and landed in the Pacific Ocean, Buzz noticed that his feet were getting wet. It turned out that the module was depressurized after the fall and water poured into it. Buzz thought how funny it would be to drown in the ocean after having completed such a dangerous journey to the moon and back. But the rescue team quickly responded and promptly delivered a helicopter to the scene, which could lift the astronauts and the capsule. Buzz was very lucky because not only did he survive, but he also completed all the tasks of the mission. Unfortunately, this wasn't possible for the Apollo 12 astronauts. November 14th, 1969, the spaceport at Cape Canaveral, Florida. The commander, Charles Conrad, looked out the window of the Kennedy Space Center. He saw the sky become overcast. It was raining, a strong wind was blowing, and in general, the weather was getting worse. This could have disrupted the second ever flight to the moon and postponed it for another month. The crowd that gathered to watch the launch was much smaller than the one that had come to watch Apollo 11 4 months earlier. But Conrad was informed that there was someone very important in this crowd, President Richard Nixon himself. Because of him, the controllers decided not to wait for the weather to improve and to carry out the launch when they had planned. And that was a huge mistake.
I was about to say, no, we're sticking to the plan. I don't care who's out there in the crowd. Are you kidding me? We've trained to stick to the plan. Why are we deviating just because someone's in the crowd? No, I'd have been hot. I'd have been mad.
At 11:22 a.m. local time, the Saturn V rocket with Charles Pete Conrad, Alan Bean, and Richard Gordon on board took off into the overcast sky. But 36 seconds later, a flash of white light surrounded it. Dozens of warning lights lit up in the cockpit at the same time. Although the crew worked out every conceivable scenario during training, none of them had ever seen so many malfunction warnings fired simultaneously. Another 16 seconds after the first flash, the second one came. Conrad tried to look at the buttons on the dashboard, but it was completely off. The captain had only a few minutes to decide to abort the flight. Despite everything, Apollo 12 was still flying in the right direction. Conrad was very hesitant about whether he should risk his life and the lives of his colleagues. And then, prompts from the engineers began to come into his earpiece. He had to immediately find the switch and restart the panel. Conrad was furious because every second mattered, and because of the panic, he couldn't cope. Suddenly, his colleague Alan Bean intervened. He quickly found and flipped the switch, and the panel lit up again. The mission was saved. But for how long? The next problem was not long in coming and was associated with the rocket's stages. They were designed so that each next stage separated from the previous one after its fuel supply was depleted. But due to the problems at the start, one of the stages detached later than it should have. As a result, it ended up in the moon's orbit instead of flying into outer space. It could become an obstacle to subsequent missions. The astronauts at that moment couldn't even imagine this part of the ship would wander in space for over 30 years until a group of amateur astronomers noticed it in 2002. The problems didn't end there. During the landing on the moon, a malfunction was discovered in one of the engines. With great difficulty, the team managed to land the module with minimal damage. The command center controllers were on edge. But the failures of Apollo 12 didn't end there. Conrad's first line on the moon was, The main center was dumbfounded because every word of the astronauts on the moon entered history. But the thing is that before the flight, Conrad had made a bet with a reporter, Oriana Fallaci, for $500 that NASA didn't write the text for the astronauts, though it wasn't the only funny thing during the Apollo 12 mission. The astronauts brought Playboy images on board and took pictures with them on the moon. And when Conrad had to step on the
Really? I'm laughing because that's probably something I would have done. They'd have been like, really? I'd be like, that's all I could think of. You want one?
moon's surface for the first time, he stumbled and fell. At that moment, the astronaut probably felt reassured that the whole world wouldn't see such an epic fall. You see, the astronauts had accidentally damaged the antenna of a color camera that was supposed to broadcast all their actions. This whole mission resembled a typical horror movie when a group of friends is having fun and joking around, while the intense music behind the scenes makes the viewer understand that these guys are in danger they haven't sensed yet. While Conrad and his colleagues were absolutely calm, things were much more stressful in the Mission Control Center. The white flash that nearly ruined the whole mission in the first seconds of the flight was lightning. So, due to the malfunction,
That's what I was saying earlier. I kept saying lightning, lightning. And I'm surprised that they didn't figure that out. The weather was bad.
caused by its impact, the team's landing parachutes could open too early. No one knew for sure if they would work properly or if the entire crew would fall. Unable to fix this issue, NASA decided to hide this information from the astronauts. Fortunately, during the flight back to Earth, the parachutes opened precisely on cue. It also turned out that in addition to the problems with the video camera, the astronauts had lost several film magazines, while some of the remaining ones got damaged. This was a real blow to scientists who hoped to study satellite images. Besides, some TV channels had already sold ads that were supposed to play during the live broadcast of the first color images from the moon. Alas, there was nothing to show, and it actually threatened any further funding for the project. Still, even this flawed mission cannot be compared to what happened to Apollo 13. John Aaron was having a rest after a long shift at the Mission Control Center. Along with other NASA employees, he worked day and night for more than a year to launch the Apollo 13 mission, during which astronauts Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes were supposed to set foot on the moon, just like their predecessors. Fortunately, the rocket launch went off without any problems. The NASA team worked around the clock to support the crew and avoid repeating past mistakes. And now, John could finally relax. But suddenly, the phone rang. John picked up the phone and heard the familiar voice of his colleague from the Mission Control Center. It sounded pretty nervous. Apparently, an oxygen tank exploded in the service module of the Apollo 13 rocket, and the astronauts were gradually losing air. John felt his heart skip a beat. In his short time at NASA, he'd gained a reputation as a technical genius who could quickly figure out a complex problem. John immediately turned on the recording of the conversation with the team and heard the now famous phrase.
Houston, we had a problem.
We got a
At
problem.
that same moment, alarm lamps lit up in the Mission Control Center, signaling power outages on the ship. It wasn't until later that the NASA Accident Investigation Board found that on that fateful day, a spark from a bare wire in an oxygen tank started a fire, rupturing one oxygen tank and damaging another. Since oxygen also fed the fuel elements of the Odyssey command module, where the astronauts were located, the aircraft's power also decreased. But at that moment, John didn't know that. He understood that every second of his doubts could cost the lives of 3 astronauts. After considering all options for emergency rescue, the engineer faced a serious dilemma. The thing was that a limited amount of oxygen remained on board, and the supply of fuel needed to return to Earth also decreased. Landing on the moon was out of the question, so they had only two options. First, they could return to Earth on a damaged module using their remaining resources and limited power supply, but risking their lives. Second, the astronauts could use the Apollo lunar module Aquarius, designed to land on the moon. In the end, the second option was chosen. Yet a new peril emerged. After redirecting the mission to return home, it was necessary to recalculate the flight path. It could pretty much lead to the astronauts simply getting lost in space. Still, it was worth the risk. The astronauts felt uncomfortable in Aquarius because it was designed solely for two people to fly in it, while the third would wait for their return. During the flight, the temperature in the cockpit quickly dropped to near zero. Some foodstuffs had become inedible, so the hungry astronauts stayed in a cold, cramped module with a limited supply of oxygen for about 90 hours. During that time, Fred Hayes developed chills and a bladder infection. Plus, on top of the stress, the astronauts were exhausted because of the lack of sleep during those 6 days of flight. At that time, John and the Flight Center team also kept their eyes open, drafting a plan to get the spacecraft on the right trajectory. Ultimately, they managed to bring the astronauts home. They were saved thanks to their own self-composure, the flight control team, and of course, John Aaron. Complex challenges fall not only upon astronauts in space, but also upon regular NASA employees controlling the flight from Earth. After that,
See, that's why it takes a special person to be an astronaut, bro. You have to be comfortable with your life being in the hands of others and whom are deemed qualified. Don't get me wrong, but you still have to remain comfortable with your life being in those people's hands. And some people can't handle that, man. That's why when you work in certain areas of like public safety, being a police officer or a firefighter or something like that, your life is in your crew's hand. If they make a mistake while you're inside of a fire, that could be all of y'all's lives. You know what I'm saying? So, yeah, you gotta have that. You gotta be comfortable with that.
Incident, numerous changes were made to the design of the service and command modules for greater security. Thus, 12 Apollo astronauts have walked on the moon throughout history, but none of this would have happened if not for the very first, and at the same time, the most tragic first mission. 1967, NASA's top test pilot, Gus Grissom, went hunting with his 13-year-old son, Mark. It was their favorite thing to do together. But on that day, the always cheerful Gus was somehow tense. He expressed his concerns about the upcoming flight, but the pilot still didn't stop joking around and told his wife, Betty, "If I die, have a party." At the same time, an experienced astronaut, Ed White, again carved something out of wood before work, had fun talking to his 14-year-old son, Edward, and watched his 7-year-old daughter, Bonnie, practice with the balance beam he made for her with his own hands. At that moment, Roger Chaffee was swimming with his 8-year-old daughter, Cheryl, in the pool, looking forward to the next step in his career as an astronaut. All of them were selected for the Apollo 1 mission. The team was supposed to make the first human-crewed flight on a spaceship. It was a crazy technological race between the USSR and the USA. The latter had already fallen behind because it was a Soviet astronaut who became the first human in space. Naturally, NASA wanted to respond by sending their astronauts straight to the moon. So the astronauts did their best to prepare for the flight, which was to take place almost a month later. On January 27th, according to the plan, they were supposed to have a training launch. The crew was already in place, and NASA workers turned on the countdown. Suddenly, Grissom smelled sulfur, which could indicate a gas leak. The countdown was immediately stopped. Gus was very annoyed that things were starting to go wrong. When technicians fixed the issue by filling the module with 100% oxygen, the odor dissipated and the countdown resumed. Here, Grissom was furious again because there were communication problems between the crew, the administrative building, and the checkpoint of the launch complex. The astronaut was outraged.
Hey, Al, you target the moon. We can't talk between 3 buildings.
Tired of dealing with communication problems, most dispatchers left their office to take a break, except one of them. And all of a sudden, that dispatcher heard some weird noise, followed by White's screams. Then more screams were heard until there was only silence left. Little Mark Grissom was playing near the house when a neighbor's child said he was urgently called home. He said something had happened at work to Mark's dad. Ed White came home on a bike after football and saw Neil Armstrong's wife, who lived next door. From her expression, he understood everything. Cheryl Chaffee's mom came into her daughter's room completely pale and said, "Daddy won't come home again." Cheryl scarily asked, "Are you getting a divorce?" And her mother burst into tears. During the test launch, a fire suddenly broke out in the cockpit of Apollo 1. Ed White was desperately trying to open the inner hatch, but it was designed so that it could only be opened from the outside. The astronauts had no chance. All 3 died. An examination showed that death was caused not...
I feel like they, you know what I mean? And you don't want to be, you don't want to say this in a way that it comes off offensive to anyone. You know what I mean? Especially the people. You want to say condolences to those families who's probably still dealing with that. But you feel like the mission was rushed on this mission. You felt like because they were trying to be, you know, to get people up there quick because their counterparts had already sent one person to space and to the moon, that they were trying to rush it too fast, and it seems like that could have been maybe the reason why things went wrong.
Not by the fire itself, but by poisoning with carbon monoxide and other toxic gases produced by the fire. Such an unexpected tragedy struck not only the astronauts' families, but also the whole of America. After that incident, NASA revised the security measures and replaced the capsule hatch with one that would quickly open outward. And the spacecraft cockpit atmosphere was changed from 100% oxygen to a mixture of oxygen and nitrogen. To this day, the moon is a commemorative medal left by the astronauts of Apollo 11, dedicated to their colleagues from the very first mission. It has been 51 years since a human has set foot on the moon's surface. Apollo 17, the final mission of NASA's Apollo program, went into space back in 1972. But NASA announces that it's once again preparing to send a human to the moon in 2025 or 2026. Would you dare to become an astronaut? Indeed, on the one hand, everything can go wrong at any mission stage. On the other hand, everything can go according to plan, and you might also have a chance to walk on the moon. Write your thoughts in the comments.
Now, I know it's going to be tons of people in the comment section like, it never happened in the first place. Rah, 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 rah. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. You know what I mean? But I'm pretty sure if you talk to those families, you'll find out your answer. If you talk to the people who actually landed, you know what I mean, different things that they did or they witnessed, I don't see nobody, you know, trying to lie about it. But who knows? You know, I think that's going to be probably one of the longest running debates there ever will be. That and flat earth theory. So, but y'all get at me in the comment section, man, and let me know what you thought of this video. And leave a like, share the video, subscribe, and stick around and stay tuned. Till next one, I'm gone. Peace.